name is Lynn and I'm studying to become a B.C.B.A. In today's video, we're going to be covering Unit 5 of BEH 5043, which is Measurements and Design. Unit 5 basically covers measurement in the natural science of behavior. So ABA is a natural science and thus it is measured like one. The units of measure that Unit 5 begins with and covers are the standard unit of measure, which is what is widely used and for multi-purposes, so like inches, feet, things like that. So that's the standard, right? And then it moves on to absolute measure, which is measure that never changes regardless of where, so like a kilogram or whatnot. And the third unit of measure that Unit 5 covers is universal, which is applied to every instance for that particular type of measure, so things like time. Now, bear in mind, I asked my co-instructor what the exact differences between standard versus absolute versus universal was, and specifically between absolute and universal, because a universal measure doesn't really change and an absolute measure doesn't really change. And he did admit he wasn't really quite sure, and it felt like a lot of people use them interchangeably, so I'm not quite sure why they really specified between the two, but it's there. So don't worry too much about it though, because you don't really get tested all that hard on it. They just want you to know that it's there. That being said, the dimensional qualities that we look at would be things like count, or which is associated with repeatability of a behavior, time, which focuses on the temporal locus or location of behavior, or the extent or duration of behavior, and it kind of goes between the two. So anything that we measure falls within count or time. Right? So you can either count it, or you can measure the duration of a behavior, or you can count if it happens before or after something, or how frequently it happens, right? That being said, there are two types of behaviors that we do measure. The free operant behavior, which can happen at any point. So a child asking to go to the bathroom, that can happen at any point. They don't necessarily need to see something around to say, hey, I need to use the restroom. A restricted operant is a behavior that only occurs within a specific situation. So if I say touch red, that's the only time that that's the opportunity that the client will touch red, right? They don't really randomly ask to touch red things, and if they did, they would just do it. They wouldn't really ask. So we do measure between the two, right? Depending on what you're measuring and what you're trying to record. So it moves on, Unit 5 moves on to the use of different graphs. So the first graph they discuss is the cumulative graph, which is more to display things like progress of a goal, or if you're trying to show feedback to someone, because a cumulative graph never goes down. It's cumulative, so it only moves up. So if you see a flat line or a plateau on a cumulative graph, it means nothing has occurred or no changes have occurred. It's just waiting for the next behavior to occur before it can move up. So this is good to like show progress or feedback to people if they're sensitive to seeing like a downshift in a visual display of their progress, so to speak. Since a cumulative graph never goes down, it just shows that, hey, you're building up. You have progress. There's continuous progress at all points. They are also used when there are limited opportunities within sessions to run things, just to also, once again, show progress of something occurring. It's best when you're trying to compare environmental variables. So let's say you're only being able to run like using the restroom, or like having an opportunity to use the restroom once per session. You'd probably just use a cumulative graph to show that, like, hey, like this kid did this successfully during this time, and it just kind of keeps going up, right? The next graphical display that we use is the standard graphical display, which is that line graph I referred to in Unit 4, which basically it produces slopes of trend, right? So increasing or decreasing trends. And it's interesting because it moves on within the unit to discuss this saying that's in ABA called "the rat is always right." Now this has been changed over to also "the learner is always right," and basically it's discussing how precision teaching works. Now it's pulled from back in the day when Skinner had his Skinner box and he had cohorts try to run certain things to teach rats a certain trick or do something in particular with their behavior, and his cohorts would say, the rat's not doing what we want it to, like there's something wrong with the rat. And that's when Skinner would come back and say, no, the rat's always right. We haven't manipulated his environment to where he understands that this is what he has to do. So that's kind of the same way that we do behaviorism, is especially with an ABA. The client isn't necessarily wrong. This is just what they've learned to actually get what they need. So if we manipulate the environment, that's when he's going to see, oh, okay, I need to do this now to get what I want. So that's kind of where it comes in, where the learner's always right. That being said, it moves on to standard acceleration charts. Standard acceleration charts are a semi-logarithmic graph, also known as an SCC for standard acceleration chart. It's also known as a ratio graph, which is it's one of the more complicated graphs. You're not going to see it too often, especially if you're becoming a B.C.B.A. You will come in contact with it, but it's very rare. It was created by a guy named Ogden Lindsay, who wanted to make it so teachers could graph everything they needed within one chart, including how many incorrects, corrects, length of time of day, almost, or time of month, I should say, because it does go by like times and days. They have different SCCs, and it goes by day, by week, and by month, and they get really complicated. So a single data point will tell you all this information depending on where it is on this single chart, and it has multiple labels on the X and Y axis to show you exactly where it is. So and the different symbols that you use to mark that data also will be indicative of what happened that day. So it's a very smart chart, I won't lie, but it's very complicated to read if you're not used to reading them. Basically, the most standard one that is used if you ever come in contact with is a per minute chart. So it's going to tell you something that occurs as frequently as 1,000 times per minute or as infrequently as 1 time per day. So it does vary pretty hard, right, on the same graph. And since it's a universal item, no matter where you put it, anyone who knows how to read the graph will be able to understand exactly how many instances of that behavior occurred within the minutes. The next thing Unit 5 covers is the differences between absolute change and relative change within a behavior. So an absolute change would be Molly got 5 questions correct on one day, and then she got 7 questions correct the next day, right? So that is an absolute change of 2, right? Because she went 5 to 7. However, relative change discusses she got 5 out of 10 correct on the first day, but then she got 7 out of 8 correct the next day. Suddenly she went from a relative grade of F to a relative grade of high B.A. status. So that's relative change, and so that's where they want to focus on a lot of the times. They will bring up relative change much more so than absolute change, because absolute change can be deceiving, right? If you only know the absolute number of difference. Then they move on to the elements within a standard acceleration chart. Now these elements, they feel esoteric at best. Once again, you're not going to come in a lot of contact with them. Almost all of my managers and supervisors I've talked to have not really touched them ever. They've seen them, they know how to read them, but they don't use them. The x-axis will cover calendar days, and this is all universal. You don't change these. This is exactly how the charts are set up. The y-axis is count per time and proportional on the axis. So it goes up by ratio. Like I said, it's a semi-logarithmic, and semi because only the y-axis goes up by ratio, not the x-axis. And then it goes on to the acceleration fan on the side, it's a legend, will define the angle and rate of change. So there's a certain angle that you can use a protractor with, and you can measure the slope, so to speak, of each data point, and you can tell what the acceleration is, if it's times 2, times 4, or cut in half by, or cut in quarters or whatnot, as far as time goes. That being said, there are it's a 6 cycle chart, so it covers 6 ranges of responding from, like I said, 1 in 1,000 in a minute to once per day, right? So it goes quite a bit. There's a jingle to remember how to count each data point when you do see a data point plotted, which is the big number on the left that starts with 1, tells you what to count by and where to count from. Now, this is hard to explain without the visual of the chart itself, but they do explain how to count it. Like I said, it's logarithmic, so it's ratio-wise, so you have to start at each ratio. Once you are able to count the data point within the ratio, then you know where to count from there, is really all they're trying to say. All rates are converted to per minute, which is, once again, you're standardizing all the data so it can be put in this chart. So you must translate all data into per minute time in order to mark it on this particular chart. Correct responsive behavior is signified by a filled in single black dot, and incorrect is marked by an X, and you calculate by multiplying the count by the time floor. The time floor is indicated on the x-axis. If you go higher up on the graph, that means that there's a shorter amount of time. So if it's less than a minute, it goes above the main middle line. Yeah, so if more behaviors happen in less than a minute, then it goes higher up on the chart. It's actually kind of opposite of what you would think. So the higher up it goes, the more frequent it occurred, which feels like it's right, but a lot of people get that wrong. So just bear that in mind. That being said, if it's below a minute, right, then that means it happened more than once, so it goes below the line. It's a very confusing chart. So if this sounds like it doesn't make sense, it's because it really takes a long time to sit down and stare at it. That being said, it moves on to the other different ways you can signify what you're graphing. So if you're graphing latency, you do a forward dash. And if you're graphing duration, you do a backwards dash. So you can mark a correct response with the dot, and then underneath that dot or above that dot, depending on where it is, you can mark a forward slash or a back dash or both to signify the latency and duration of that response. So all within a single line, you're putting a lot of data, right? To do the counting floor or the length of time that you used to measure, you actually draw a flat line, and that's usually under the correct amount of data points. So like if you mark a correct response, you write the floor line underneath it. And then in 0 instances, you mark just under the counting floor. So you would mark like a dot underneath the counting floor to show that there was 0 instances that occurred for that time floor. Basically, the whole unit covers all the nitty-gritty of an SCC. It's kind of confusing as to why they do it because, like I said, not a lot of people come in contact with it. Even the co-instructors did mention that like it really depends. You have to be in a really clinical setting for this to be a regular thing that you see. But the end of the unit basically says that what separates ABA from other social sciences is basically how we measure it. And the standard acceleration chart was created within the world of ABA in order to show all the data that we do collect within a single universal piece of information, right? So it is a graphical display. It is something that's a bit esoteric, but it is standardized, right? It is universal. No matter who learns it, it's all going to mark the same language. It's all understanding the same data. So it is important to know because you're going to be tested on it, but I wouldn't freak out too hard on this particular unit because there was only like 2 questions on the unit exam about it. So if you feel a little confused, don't worry. Just look at the graph, look at what they want you to read in the legend, and you should be good from there. Hopefully this didn't scare you too much from Unit 5. It's not the scariest one out there, believe it or not, so just keep studying this particular one, and if you have additional questions about it, leave it down below and I'll try to explain it a bit further, and hopefully with graphical display it'll be easier to see as well. So I'll touch base on that a little later. Okay, until then, bye.